Thanks for tuning into this episode of History's Greatest Battles, and happy holidays. If you know somebody that enjoys this genre of history, please share the podcast with them. In 1942, a catastrophic and humiliating defeat shattered the British Empire's hold on Southeast Asia, exposing the fragility of its colonial dominance. This battle marked the collapse of Britain's most critical stronghold in the region, setting off a chain reaction that reshaped the political and economic future of the world. For the men who fought to defend it, the battle was a descent into hell, an unrelenting siege marked by desperation, starvation, and relentless bombardment. When the defenses crumbled, the horrors didn't end. The civilian population faced brutal retribution under occupation, with tens of thousands tortured or killed in acts of calculated terror. The effects of this loss are not confined to history. The political borders, economic dynamics, and alliances of today owe much to the fallout from this moment, from this battle. From the emergence of post-colonial nations to the rise of modern Singapore as an economic powerhouse, the consequences of this defeat continue to shape the world. This episode unpacks the strategies, the failures, and the human cost and profound global impact of one of the most consequential battles of the 20th century. Let's now experience the Battle of Singapore.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 1, Episode 86, The Battle of Singapore, the 31st of January through the 15th of February, 1942. British forces, 107,000 troops, including roughly 27,000 administrative soldiers. Japanese forces, 40,000 soldiers. The fall of Singapore was a cataclysmic turning point, the crowning triumph of Japan's unstoppable advance through the Malay Peninsula during World War II. With its prized bastion in the Far East torn from its grasp, Britain suffered not just a military defeat, but a symbolic total humiliation. This moment sent shockwaves through the empire, igniting the slow collapse of a dominion that had once claimed mastery over the globe, leading to the dissolution of the once dominance of the British Empire.
In the early 1800s, Great Britain planted its flag in Singapore, claiming the island as a bastion of imperial power and commerce. Here, amidst the sweltering heat of Southeast Asia, British ambition clashed with Dutch dominance, the city becoming the keystone of British trade in the region. Singapore was more than a trading hub. It was a fortress. Over time, its towering defenses earned a name whispered with reverence and pride, the, quote, Gibraltar of the East, end quote. Colossal coastal guns guarded Singapore with their barrels stretching seaward, daring an enemy to approach. These iron leviathans inspired confidence, not just among the soldiers stationed there, but also in the hearts of distant British leaders who saw the city as an unassailable stronghold. Yet, Japan did not flinch. The monstrous artillery could shred any fleet that dared to approach, but the very power of these guns betrayed their fatal flaw. They were pointed out to sea, blind to the threat creeping ever closer from the Malay Peninsula. An attack from the landward side seemed unthinkable. Two narrow roads snaked through an unforgiving landscape of dense jungle and swamp terrain so hostile it was thought to be an impregnable barrier in its own right. Any force bold or foolish enough to take those two roads could be bottled up with ease, or so the British strategists believed. Yet the defenders of the British Empire clung to an illusion of security, a dangerous complacency that would soon unravel. Meanwhile, on the Japanese-controlled island of Formosa, a different kind of army was being forged. Throughout 1941, specialists in jungle warfare honed their craft, devising methods to move men through the most hostile terrain. These soldiers, hardened in the wilds of Formosa, would emerge as the most formidable jungle fighters of the era. As 1941 wore on, and Japan's shadow loomed ever larger over Asia, the British officials in Singapore sent desperate pleas to London, calling for reinforcements to bolster their fragile defenses. But Winston Churchill, laser-focused on the European theater and in the fight in North Africa, could spare little for Singapore. A trickle of reinforcements arrived, Indian Army divisions and Australian troops, but it was far from enough to stand against the storm that was coming. By the 8th of December 1941, when the Pacific War erupted in fire and fury, Singapore's defenders numbered some 107,000 soldiers. They included the battle-hardened Australian 8th Division, the Indian Army's 9th, 11th, and 17th Divisions, and the British 18th Division. This seemed like a mighty host, but numbers alone wouldn't be enough. Beneath the surface, however, cracks in this force were glaring. Many of the Indian units lacked proper equipment and even training, their readiness a patchwork effort hurriedly stitched together in the face of looming war. The British had drawn up plans to station troops at key points in Thailand and along the Malay Peninsula, logical moves to meet an invasion head-on. But London, wary of provoking Japan, kept the troops in place, a gamble that would soon cost them dearly. When the Japanese struck on the 8th of December, they wasted no time exploiting British hesitation. Their forces swept ashore in amphibious landings at Kota Baru, Patani, and Singora, seizing these critical positions with barely a fight. From these footholds, the Japanese surged south along the two Malay roads. The Indian 11th Division tried to dig in at Jitra, hoping to stall their advance, but the Japanese slipped through the jungle, bypassing the defenses with precision that left the defenders stunned. By the 12th of December, the Indian 11th had abandoned Jitra, their confidence shattered by the shock of Japanese maneuvers that seemed to come from nowhere. Time and again, attempts to mount a defense collapsed. British Empire troops, rattled and demoralized, retreated at the first sign of danger, forfeiting opportunities to inflict lasting harm on the advancing enemy. The retreat was a grim routine: hold a river crossing just long enough to demolish the bridge, then fall back again. But the Japanese brought engineering units and bridging equipment in abundance, tearing through these delays. When the jungle itself momentarily slowed the Japanese advance, their forces simply pivoted. Swift, coordinated amphibious landings outflanked the defenders, cutting off escape routes and rendering resistance futile. By January's end, the Malay Peninsula was firmly under Japanese control. The battered remnants of the British Empire's forces streamed into Singapore, their retreat a shadow of the Empire's once proud might. Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the architect of Japan's Lightning Campaign, had orchestrated a near-flawless advance, yet victory did little to temper his frustration. Political rivals in Tokyo had left his operation undermanned and under-equipped, and one of his divisional commanders proved an insubordinate thorn in his side throughout the campaign. Yamashita's staff was cobbled together in haste, far from the polished machine he might have hoped for. Yet, despite these glaring disadvantages, his success was undeniable. Swift, relentless, and devastating. Now, the prize of Singapore lay before him, the final jewel waiting to be claimed. For 4 days, Yamashita tested Singapore's defenses, searching for weakness. He devised a bold gambit, a feint against the eastern straits to lure British reinforcements away from his true target. With the defenders distracted, Yamashita unleashed his main assault. 2 divisions surged across the western straits, the real thrust of his attack. The narrow geography of the straits played into Yamashita's hands. The causeway spanned 1,100 yards, but at the strait's narrowest point, only 600 yards of water separated the Japanese from their prize, a crossing that could be made in mere minutes. Once ashore, the Japanese faced little resistance. Beach defenses were sparse, and their path to the city cut through patches of jungle and sprawling rubber plantations, obstacles the Japanese forces had long mastered. On paper, a determined defense might have held the line, but in practice, it was a different story. Singapore's defenses, once so lauded, now revealed their fatal shortcomings. Trenches and tank traps were almost non-existent, save for a scant few near the western shore. The mighty coastal guns, symbols of Singapore's strength, could be swiveled to face the advancing Japanese, but they were forced to fire blind. lobbing shells across the city at targets over 15 miles away, an act of desperation rather than precision. Lacking a proper system for artillery spotting, the defenders were effectively shooting in the dark. By the time corrections reached the gunners, their targets had already vanished or shifted beyond reach. The defenders were scattered along the beaches, waiting for an attack they couldn't see coming. And under the cover of night, Japanese forces came ashore, spreading across a wide front, slipping past and outflanking the disoriented defenders. By dawn, Japanese tanks rumbled ashore, an unstoppable force for which the defenders had no effective weapons. From London, Churchill demanded that Singapore be held at all costs, even reduced to rubble, before it was surrendered. Yet those on the ground knew that a prolonged defense was a fantasy. They were outgunned, they were outmaneuvered, and they were out of time. The situation grew dire as water supplies dwindled. Japanese bombers had crippled the pumping stations, leaving the defenders parched and desperate in the stifling tropical heat. Worse than the physical toll was the collapse of morale. Hope had bled from the defenders, and among the poorly trained Indian units, this despair translated into chaotic, ineffective resistance. The relentless Japanese artillery tore into the city day and night, battering both buildings and spirits. Overhead, their planes ruled the skies unchallenged, amplifying the defenders' sense of helplessness. Unbeknownst to the British, Yamashita's forces were running dangerously low on ammunition. Their supplies stretched to the breaking point. Yamashita made a bold calculation. He ordered his forces to keep up the pressure, expending precious ammunition to maintain the illusion of overwhelming strength. A pause, he feared, might tip the British off to his vulnerability and reignite their resistance. The gamble paid off. On the 15th of February 1942, the defenders, battered and broken, laid down their arms, and Singapore was lost. In just over 2 months of brutal combat, the British Empire's forces suffered nearly 9,000 dead and dying, a grim tally for a campaign so swiftly lost. The Japanese, outnumbered at nearly every turn, paid their price as well, with 3,000 killed and another 7,000 wounded. Yet for their losses, the Japanese claimed Singapore largely intact. The city's vital harbor stood ready for use, and its warehouses brimmed with supplies, a prize far beyond any value. Along with the city, the Japanese captured 130,000 prisoners, military personnel and civilians alike, a human tide that now swelled under Japanese control. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, the British commander, secured Yamashita's assurance that the city's civilians would be treated humanely. That promise, like so much else in war, was quickly shattered. The city's Chinese population bore the brunt of Japanese brutality. As many as 70,000 were tortured, executed, or left to die in atrocities that remain a scar on history. A handful of British Empire troops evaded capture, vanishing into the jungle to organize Malay militias. Supplied by Indian Army airdrops, they became an irritant to the Japanese, but never a true strategic threat. Among these resistance groups emerged the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army, a communist force whose actions would sow the seeds of Britain's post-war struggles in Singapore. Groups like the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army became the loudest voices for independence when Britain sought to reclaim its authority over Singapore after the war. In the chaotic weeks following Japan's surrender, underground factions turned on one another, trading accusations of collaboration and carrying out grim acts of retribution. Order was tenuously restored under a British military administration, a fragile attempt to stabilize the shattered region. The political upheaval mirrored the dire realities faced by the Malay population. Years of war had decimated agriculture, and the region's economic infrastructure lay in total ruin. By 1946, Britain reluctantly moved toward granting independence to the Malay Peninsula, but Singapore remained a jewel it was unwilling to relinquish. For London, Singapore's strategic and economic value outweighed the growing calls for self-rule. Britain's first attempt at crafting a post-war constitution for the Malay Peninsula envisioned a strong central government, but the independent Malay states flatly rejected this imposition. In 1948, Britain introduced a revised framework, establishing a looser confederation that better aligned with the population's expectations. Singapore clung to British rule for another decade. By 1958, however, the city gained self-governance, with Britain retaining control solely over its defense. The fall of Singapore in 1942 marked the beginning of the end for the British Empire, a symbolic blow from which imperial dominance would never recover. In the aftermath of World War I, the great powers clung to their colonial empires, but the tide of independence movements following World War II proved unstoppable, eroding their grip piece by piece. Japan's conquest of Southeast Asia shattered the illusion of European invincibility, demonstrating to subjugated Asian populations that their colonial overlords were not an untouchable master race. The loss of Singapore was a humiliation for Britain, but the speed and ease of its collapse dealt a psychological blow that reverberated far beyond the battlefield. After the war, Britain's eastern holdings in the Indian Ocean slipped away in rapid succession. The empire unraveled. While the Dutch suffered the greatest territorial losses in the region, Britain's grip on India was already slipping. Singapore's fall was the first domino in the chain leading to the end of British rule in the subcontinent. By the close of the century, Hong Kong was Britain's last foothold in Asia, a possession that was finally ceded to China in 1997. The British Empire, once a global titan where the sun never set, fractured into pieces. What remained was the British Commonwealth, a loose association of former imperial holdings, a faint echo of Britain's once unmatched power.